Global Wall Street wasn't just focused on the developed world when it came to Davos. The developing world also got a fair amount of attention, starting with sub-Saharan Africa, which Citi's Jane Fraser says is very much on her client's mind.
A lot of the discussions we're having, particularly interestingly with a lot of our Middle Eastern clients, is what are they doing about Africa? I think Africa is one that we've all got to keep our mind on, because that is where the net growth in the workforce is going to come over the next few decades. If we get it right, it's a wonderful opportunity. If we don't, it's going to cause a lot of problems, both in Africa, as well as in Europe, as well as other parts of the world. And so looking at how do we build out transmission networks, greener supply chains there.
And the Biden administration echoes what Citi is hearing from its clients, as the United States Trade Representative Katherine laid out plans to support and engage Africa and described the great opportunities for the world economy there.
President Biden hosted the African leaders at a summit in December in Washington, D.C. And I think it came at just the right time. The message that we wanted to send across the board, across the administration, was that America is ready to partner with Africa, to work for Africa, with Africa. On trade, we've got our baseline trade program. It's a preference program. It's called the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It is set to be reauthorized in 2025. Now is exactly the right time to be reviewing what performance has been like, how effective has this been in stimulating and fostering development, economic development and investment in our partner economies, and then also to start thinking, how do we make this better and more effective? It is very clear from all of the engagements that we had last December in Washington, D.C., including my trip to Nairobi for President Ruto's inauguration in September, the future really is Africa. The resources in Africa, whether they are in the ground or that they are the human beings, the people of Africa, the potential is tremendous. If we can find the way through trade, economics, investment, finance, to unlock the potential of Africa and its people, Africa could be the engine that drives economic growth and prosperity for the next phase of globalization. But it is going to require us to think big and to be creative, because the tools that we have so far haven't done what we know we need to do in this next phase.
President Biden also just recently traveled to Mexico City for a North American summit meeting with the head of Canada, Mexico, as well as President Biden. There are trade issues pending under the USMCA and other places, particularly involving energy. Mm-hmm. Where do those stand? Are they being resolved? What's the timetable?
So there is an energy consultation that we are engaged in right now. Both the United States and Canada have requested consultations with Mexico. Those consultations are ongoing. We have certainly gotten Mexico's attention. They know we care deeply about this. Our economies are and have been inextricably linked for many decades now. And we are the kind of partners, we are neighbors. Geography is never going to change. We're going to be neighbors forever. So these are really important conversations. They are about energy policy. They are about our vision for a competitive North American future. We are still in consultations, and we are committed to finding a solution here using whatever tools are available, including the ones under the USMCA.
The pandemic drove home some of the great disparities between the developing and the developed world. Pfizer chairman and CEO Bourla explained how the mRNA vaccine that his company developed with BioNTech was made available for free, and how that has led to a much broader initiative.
The vaccines, particularly our vaccine, all countries in the world were offered completely free through a brave move that the government made, the US government. They bought 1 billion doses from us at cost, and they offered it for free to the world. Unfortunately, they were not able to absorb it because there is no demand for those vaccines, unfortunately, in the poorest of the countries. But nevertheless, that gave us the whole story with COVID, sensitized even more. So 9 months ago, here in Davos, we launched an accord where we said that Pfizer will offer all the patent-protected products, which means the products that generic manufacturers cannot make cheap copies. At cost, and we say at cost is manufacture and send. No regulatory, no compliance, no legal, no administrative, no research. To 1.2 billion people living in the 45 poorest countries of the world. That happened 9 months ago, and already by the end of the year we had sent products to some of these countries. What we did yesterday was even more historic move. We announced not all our patent protected, but all our products. This moves the list from 23 products to over 500.
Wow, so it's not just the ones patent protected, it's
Everything
all of your
else.
products across
Because we were hearing when we were giving, for example, would give them maybe the most prescribed breast cancer medicine in the world, high technology, but they would say we have also needs for antibiotics, we have needs for antiparasitics, we have needs for anesthetics or basic chemotherapy, and we heard them and then we did everything.
I must say, that sounds wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
It is wonderful.
Why did you do it?
Because we ought to do it. I don't think there is no reason why the poorest countries in the world right now won't have access to the same medicines that kids in America or in France are having.
One of the reasons I think Pfizer has been as successful as it has been is because there's been investment in science, basically. What about larger, for the US government and other governments, are we investing enough in basic R&D? Could that help you?
I think it would help, and I think there is a lot of work happening, particularly in the US, and this is why in the US has attracted all the research investments of the private sector. If you see what is going on, even companies that are European companies are doing most of their research in the US because this is where things are happening. I think it is the crown jewel of the US industry, the life sciences.
You know healthcare so terribly well, Dr. Bourla. Let me ask you what you think the biggest challenge is. Is it actually having the drugs, the pharmaceuticals to administer, or is it actually the infrastructure to get it delivered? You mentioned earlier that you actually couldn't get some of the COVID vaccines in some countries that needed it.
No, there is no doubt in Africa, it is not the availability of the products. Of course, you need to have them and you need to have them in prices that you can pay. But once you resolve that, which we just did, you are going to have very big problems with infrastructure. You don't have the right healthcare professionals to administer, to make the diagnosis. This is where we should help. This is where we should help, us included.
One of the ways those in the developing world are addressing the needs that they have is by migrating, something that has created a crisis in the United States along the southern border. But Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan says that the biggest challenge ahead for the U.S. economy is not keeping people out, but getting more workers into the country.
I think we're getting a lesson right now in the fact that America is this wonderful place for people to work and live and prosper, and the problem is we need more people. We just need more capacity. And the point I always say when people say this, that, everything, it says, well, it takes 18 years to get an 18-year-old. That is science, and nobody can refute. Okay, so if we're going to have enough workers to do all this nearshoring, all this onshoring, to put up the windmills all over Texas and Oklahoma, places that are being built, to put up the solar fields, to build the pipelines, we got to get some people in this country, and so we have to figure out a way to do it that works.
Surprisingly, given the tight job market, particularly in the United States, the challenge of making sure workers at the bottom are making a living wage is not going away. Neela Richardson, she's chief economist at ADP, came to Switzerland to address this very issue.
There's a big gap between market wages, minimum wages that are instituted by governments, and what it takes to actually survive in this world in terms of housing, basic necessities, food, clothing, shelter. And in the context of high inflation, even as it moderates, it doesn't mean that those prices are going down. They've already gone up. They're just going to grow more slowly. So for the typical worker, their wages haven't kept up with inflation. And even before the pandemic, their wages weren't keeping up for the lower end of the paid workers with just basic necessities. So this is a global issue, and it deserves the world's attention.
Okay, so let's assume the world actually pays attention. I hope it does.
Yeah.
What does it do about it?
Well, there's actually benefits to paying people fairly, believe it or not. When companies, and there have been companies that have been very prominent on this issue. Adecco was on our panel, the CEO. Unilever made comments on living wages on his panel on the cost of living crisis. And what they've identified is there's actually benefits to paying people fairly. It leads to more engagement, it leads to more retention, and it leads to something that the world should really want right now, now? Social stability when workers are secure. So at a time when there's labor shortages in advanced economies, paying people fairly makes good bottom line sense for companies as well.
Okay, so Unilever says, yes, we think it's good to pay people more. Is a private sector solution the solution? Is it public sector? Does it have to be both?
It has to be both. It really has to be both. Governments have to really intervene, because when there's a gap between a market wage and a living wage, that is the perfect context for government intervention whenever you see these gaps in our economy. And so the governments can do a lot of things. Several states, more than 20 of them, have raised minimum wages just this year because of inflation, because of the recognition that with really high housing prices and just the cost of living crisis, that people are not making enough to cover the basics. So governments do have a role, companies have a role as well.